On today's show, we'll be talking about depression and the workplace. Hello, I'm Shannon Skinner, and this is Extraordinary Women TV. My guest today is Jan Wong. She is the author of Out of the Blue, a memoir of workplace depression, recovery, redemption, and yes, happiness. Really glad to have her here today. Now, before you meet her, later in the segment, before we take a break, I'll have my regular Good to Know Minute when I ask my guests for their top success tip, and you'll hear Jan's. Well, Jan Wong, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's so nice having you here. Now, you've written a number of books. You've been a journalist for 30 years. You've been a writer for a long time. Now, before you started your career in journalism, you did something that I thought was very interesting, and you went and you spent some time in China during the Cultural Revolution. You were at McGill and then decided that you were going to go over there. What was that experience like for you?
It was like being in Disneyland, except it was all communist. So I was really interested in Maoism and in Chinese culture. I'm a third generation Canadian. So I grew up not speaking Chinese at home because my parents are Canadian born too. And so I wasn't very good in any of the sciences or maths. So at university I had to figure out what I was going to do that I could eventually use to earn a living, and I couldn't figure out anything. And then I thought, well, maybe I could specialize in Chinese studies and maybe become a journalist eventually. So I majored in Asian history, and I couldn't speak Chinese. And I knew that for graduate school, I would have to read and write Chinese. So I went to China in 1972, and it was the middle of the Cultural Revolution. So I was it was completely strange.
Right.
But I loved it because I was very radical as a university student. So I was a Maoist, even though I really didn't understand what that meant.
Right.
And so I ended up going as a student for my summer vacation, but I bugged them until they let me stay and study. And I became the first Canadian to study there during the Cultural Revolution. And I ended up at Beijing University.
I mean, at that time, you loved it. What was it so much that you loved about it?
Well, they kept talking about creating a new person, about being where women would be equal and everybody would work for the good of the state and the good of society in general. And coming out of the 70s, it sounded like a great thing to do. I only saw problems because, of course, the Vietnam War was going on at that point. And if you were a thinking university student in those years, and if you were majoring in some kind of the arts, then typically you would be anti-American imperialism. So because that's what I felt, I thought, well, China was the beacon of hope for the world. You had to be there.
Yeah, sure.
You had to be there. And so that's why I wanted to go to China, and it was very actually trendy because Richard Nixon had just gone.
Interesting.
The Cold War was still on, but China suddenly became very fashionable, and the Mao suit became fashionable. And a few years later, Bloomingdale's in New York was advertising all these Chinese sort of Mao suits in their window. So the whole idea of China, when I said Disneyland, I meant that it was almost like this fantasy world you would go into. And in Disneyland, I only went there recently. I resisted it for years, but everybody's acting out a role in Disneyland, and they're not allowed to break out of their role. So even the people, they don't have anyone actually picking up garbage. What they do is they have people dressed in nice clothes who, if they see any garbage on the ground, will pick it up. But there's no caretaker role because it's kind of demeaning. So they have all the happy people in Disneyland, and they have all the characters, Mickey Mouse, Snow White. Well, China was very much like that. People did not break out of role. So when I was there, they would tell me how wonderful the society was, but it wasn't true.
Well, it's interesting. And then so you chose to become a journalist.
Yes, because of that experience in China, with everyone telling me stuff that wasn't true. So I became very interested in propaganda and in trying to get at the truth behind a story.
And so you've had quite a successful career as a journalist. You've had
More or less.
But you had the dream career that so many journalists wish for. You've written for the New York Times,
Right.
a number of
Wall Street Journal.
Wall Street Journal.
But my goal, of course, was to go back to Beijing, and that I achieved. So that was, it's true, I did have a dream career.
Yeah. Now, in your, I mean, did you know any journalists when you decided you want to be a journalist? Was there somebody that you said, okay, they're telling the truth. I think that they're, able to drill down and share a message. I want to do this too?
No, I had no role models.
Okay.
Isn't that odd?
It's interesting.
There was no one who looked like me who was in the journalism business. And I think, it was just, I don't know where I got it from. Oh, I know. My role model was Lois Lane. Really? Because I love Superman comics.
Yeah.
I didn't identify with Superman. I identified with Lois Lane.
Right.
Even though she never seemed to actually do any real stories. She was always running around with her notepad.
Oh,
she was
yeah.
always in the middle of the action. So I guess she was my role model. But I didn't have any real live role models in Canadian journalism because no one looked like me except Adrienne Clarkson. But she didn't work as a journalist. She had a talk show. So that wasn't anything that I was interested in. I was interested in the front lines, running around trying to find out information.
So Jan, what was it like for you working as a journalist here in Canada in the newsroom? I mean, what was that world like?
Well, it was very exciting and lots of fun. And what you find is if you do a good job, then they'll just keep giving you more stories, and you keep, doing this stuff that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're good at both reporting and at writing, it's often very hard to get both talents in a reporter. But if you're good at both, then you can basically write your own ticket. So I could do all the stories that I wanted to do, and sometimes I would come up with my own ideas. So that's the most gratifying, is when you can set your own agenda. So I loved it.
And journalists are really known to be able to just crank out the writing, almost like they're machines. So it's the envy of writers.
Yeah, we don't have writer's block. You cannot have writer's block if you work for a daily newspaper.
Yeah.
Because you only have 2 hours to write it, or if you're lucky. Sometimes you have less. And nobody has writer's block who works at a newspaper. You can't. I mean, I never saw anyone with a writer's block. It doesn't exist. You have to just sit down and write.
And well, there's the deadlines, and then there's the paycheck, and there's so much pressure to make sure that you actually succeed in what you're doing.
Right, and you don't want the opposition. You don't want your competition to beat you.
Right.
So it's not just like you're working in your own vacuum. You've got to make sure that they don't have the story. You have the story first. So it is a lot of stress.
Now, you worked for the Globe and Mail for a number of years. I read you quite a bit, and
Thank
you. What set you apart from many other journalists is that, I mean, you were really the ultimate investigative journalist. And you had some really great assignments, very brave assignments. At that, while you were working there. Something had changed, and you wrote a story on Dawson Creek and the incident there, and that changed everything for you. Do you remember that moment when you thought, my life has just changed?
It wasn't one single moment. So what happened is I covered a school shooting at Dawson College in Montreal, and I was urged by my editors to do analysis, to include analysis, which was very common because newspapers were searching for a way to compete in this digital age. So we didn't just deliver the news, we also gave you opinion and analysis with it. And so my analysis included why were all 3 post-secondary school shootings in Montreal, and why were all 3 of the perpetrators minorities. Neither francophones nor anglophones, but ethnics. And so I wrote this story, and there was a terrible backlash, and my newspaper, the Globe and Mail, didn't stand behind me. It's okay to run 13 letters to the editor. We got letters from the Prime Minister and the Premier, and of course we're going to run those. We like that. What I didn't like was being hung out to dry by an editor who sort of pushed me out the front door and said it's her fault. And he wrote a column saying that the process had broken down in the newsroom. It hadn't broken down. He had edited it, he had read it, everybody thought it was great, and they published it. So when you do that, you have to stand behind it, but they didn't. So that was one moment of feeling betrayed. And then another big moment was a death threat. I got a death threat.
Yeah.
And then they didn't call the police. That was another big moment. Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Because I had a death threat previously, and everything is taken care of. You don't have to call the cops yourself. And then there was the biggest blow was when I became clinically depressed, and they did not believe me. That was just like right over the edge for me.
Yeah, so this whole, the stress of the situation and whatnot did I guess like so many people when they have loss or there's suddenly a change, experience depression. But the difference between you and somebody else is that this was your workplace.
Yeah, it was my identity.
It was your identity.
But it's not, a lot of people go through this same thing. And so in my book, I write about my specific case, but I try to make it as universal as I can because workplace depression is extremely common. And when you lose your job, I got fired because I was ordered back to work and I was still depressed. And
you needed to heal.
Well, one aspect of my depression was my inability to write. So it was really a problem for me. If I physically walked into the newsroom, which I could do, I could walk, but I couldn't write. So I was afraid to go back. My doctor said it would make me worse. So my problem was the questioning of my integrity. So when I lost my job, well, even when I was being questioned for my integrity, that was devastating for me because I only had my integrity as a reporter. Every time I did a story, basically you had to believe me when I told you I did this and I interviewed this person. And there's a lot of journalists who sort of fudge around or make it up. All we have is our integrity. And
of course, you were known to be a tough journalist.
Yeah.
Tough was the word that was often used.
So I think part of it could have been ignorance on the part of the public and the employer and myself about who gets depressed. I had never been depressed before.
Yeah.
So when it hit me, I didn't understand what was happening. And what I learned is that strength of personality has nothing to do with whether or not you succumb to depression. You don't have to be weak. It's not at all related to that. It's brain chemicals. Just like a strong person can get the flu or AIDS, a strong person can get depression too. It has nothing to do with if you're weak or strong.
And of course, this sparked you to write the book that we're here to talk about today, Out of the Blue. But before we do, we're going to take a break. And that means it's my Good to Know Minute. And Jan, I know you've got a great success tip, so jump right in there.
So my success tip is be brave. And it's something that you can't just be. You have to try every day to be brave. It's a goal that you aim for. And I tell my students, I teach journalism now in Fredericton at St. Thomas University, and I tell them that bravery is a muscle and you have to exercise it every day. And I mean in every aspect of your life. So for instance, if you see someone getting bullied, there's no such thing as an innocent bystander. You must be brave, you must speak up, you must intervene. And that's what I mean by being brave. If your employer is stomping on you and crushing you, but you're right, you have to be brave and you have to speak up and say, I will not do that. I will not bow my head and succumb to you because you're wrong. So that's what I mean by being brave. And I think it's a good mantra for your whole life. And it's a good mantra for young people to remember that it's not that whether or not you are brave, but you have to try to be brave. And the braver you are, the braver you will be.
Well, that's good to know, and thank you for that, so be brave. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, more with Jan Wong, an author. So stay where you are. Welcome back to the show. I'm Shannon Skinner, and I'm speaking with author Jan Wong. So before the break, we sort of left it off that your experience with depression, working for the Globe and Mail, sparked you to write the book, Out of the Blue. Let's talk about, I mean, what is this book about at its core?
This book is about going through clinical depression and coming out the other side. So it's about the descent and the recovery, and how to cope with it, what it means, and why it actually is beneficial to go through something like a clinical depression, because it changes you, and I think it changes you for the better. It makes you more sensitive, more aware, and more appreciative. And in my case, you know, good things happened as a result of what I went through.
You talk about the gift that you got of the relationship with your sister that had deteriorated.
Right. So before I became clinically depressed, my sister hadn't been speaking to me for several years. I think about 2 years, I'm not sure. And it was following the death of our mother. She went into, something happened, and I think I don't really understand it, but she wasn't speaking to me. But when I became sick with depression, she just came and helped me and stayed with me the whole time. And when I say help me, I don't mean making me cups of tea. I mean, she was there by my side for every bit of the fight. This is not just about clinical depression, it's about workplace depression and dealing with your employer. And in my case, I also had a union, because older newspapers are unionized because we're a very old industry. So I was also trying to battle my union that just wanted me to take a package and go away. And the reason I couldn't and I wouldn't is because it came with a gag order. And that was what my big battle was, freedom of speech. And for me as a journalist, I had to have my freedom. So it's all intertwined in the book. And the book was a real struggle. I had a real struggle to write it because I wasn't able to write for a long time when I was depressed. But people didn't want me to write this book. They tried to stop me by imposing gag orders, and I wouldn't do that. So my sister, who is very tough, actually, she was there and standing by my side and attended many of the mediations and arbitrations. I had to go through two years of this legal stuff. And it was really hard. It's really hard, but I'm finding from my readers now, I'm getting emails from lots of people who've gone through the same thing. And most people don't hang in there. And that's why I think it's very important to be brave and to know when you are right and to stick to your guns, and otherwise you'll be broken. If I agreed to that, I would have been broken as a reporter, as a writer, as a person.
What do you hope to achieve with the book?
Well, I want to start a dialogue, a conversation about mental illness.
Yeah.
I want people to know that they are not alone. I want to start to end the stigma. There's a lot of stigma about mental illness, which I had internalized myself. So weird things, and I talk about this in the book, like I go to my family doctor and I'm crying all the time. This is at the beginning when I don't know what's wrong with me. And her receptionist asked me, well, what do you want to see her for? And I'm just so embarrassed. I don't want anyone in the reception room to hear me. So I don't understand why. So in the book, I talk about stigma. I look at the history of our attitude to mental illness. And I trace it right back to ancient Greece and then medieval times. It's very interesting.
And also the interesting thing I think about your book is that you do your best to go back to the time that you were experiencing those emotions, like being in the doctor's office and what it looked like. And it led you to believe, as you came through healing, on the other side of healing, that everything sort of seemed warped at the time when you were depressed. So that for you was an eye-opener.
Well, because as a journalist, I'm always writing about things and observing things. And what was very interesting about being depressed was that your view of reality is skewed. You see a distorted reality. People will say things to you. Now, I'm not making up the quotes, but my interpretation of what they said to me is different than a healthy person. So I might think that they were being really mean to me when they said something. But in fact, it was probably just a neutral statement. like there's a scene in there where I'm meeting a journalist at a cocktail party, and she says to me, I think they wanted to get rid of you from the get-go. Now, she's absolutely right, but it stung me.
Right.
And I felt like crying, and I felt like that was an attack on me. And
because everything's intensified.
Yeah, well, everything is skewed.
Yeah.
So I couldn't even remember the color of the sofa in my psychiatrist's office. I got the color all wrong. And so what it told me is that when depressed people don't see reality in the same way. And I think it's very important to talk about that, because it is a mental illness.
Right.
And then when you recover, like if she said that to me today, I probably would have gone, yeah, you're absolutely right. That the journalist saying they wanted to get rid of you from the get-go. And I don't think it would have felt like crying or anything. I would have gone, you're right.
You feel stronger.
Well, I'm healthy.
Right.
So there's a difference between depression, which is a mental illness,
right,
and being healthy. So by writing this book, I want to make people feel it's okay. It's okay to talk about it. It's the last taboo, right? We used to not talk about cancer. We didn't talk about AIDS.
Right.
You know, this is the last taboo, to talk about being clinically depressed.
So Jan, in writing this book, as a writer, as a journalist, and you know, you are so used to analyzing and dissecting, what did you learn the most from this experience?
I learned that it's completely treatable. Clinical depression can be treated. So go to your doctor, and if your doctor can recommend you to a psychiatrist, even better, and that talk therapy works. You have to find a psychiatrist or a doctor who you feel you trust. Mm-hmm. If you don't trust them, it's not going to work. Talk therapy works, and so do antidepressants. They don't, I mean, for me, I had a messy experience. I had to go through 4 before I found one that seemed to do the job. But it works. It's not addictive. It's not permanent, unless you have lifelong depression. But that's not what this book is about. This book is about an episode.
Situational.
Yeah, situational. So it's entirely treatable. So don't suffer. And also that suicidal thoughts are common. So please understand that if you feel like killing yourself, this is part of the territory. But you can be treated, and you can come out the other side, and you'll be fine. And I also want people to know that you will come out a stronger person, and probably a nicer person, because I was very harsh as a journalist, and I think I'm a little more understanding now.
So it's changed you.
Yeah, I think for the better.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Now, of course, you published the book on your own, because there was yet another a little surprise where the publisher pulled out. Yeah. So you published your book independently. Right. I mean, what was that experience?
No one else would publish it. I'm an established author.
Yeah.
No one else would publish it.
A well-recognized journalist.
Well, my publisher, at the 11th hour, the book was done. We had edited it for several years, and it was on the way to copy edit, which, as you know, is the last stage. I have nothing more to do. And that's when they said, we don't really want this Globe stuff in here. And I said, it's about workplace depression. It's only a little bit about the Globe. They're just the narrative thread, right?
You kind of have to mention the
I can't do workplace depression without the workplace.
Yeah.
So my agent tried others, and what I found remarkably was that no one wanted to publish it. And what I also found in the writing of it is there's no other book that I could find on workplace depression as a memoir. There are books by experts. So I thought, I have to get this book out. If I have to self-publish it, I will, and I did.
So where can people actually get a copy?
Everywhere, because I happen to be extremely lucky. So I have distribution, so Indigo, Loblaws, Shoppers, every independent bookstore has it. Your public library will have it across Canada.
Great.
It's available, Amazon will have it. I sell it on my website. Free
What's
shipping.
Your URL?
It's janwong.ca.
.ca, right. Okay,
and I will autograph it for you. And it's available as an ebook. Like, it's saturation. I've managed to pull it off, which is not easy, but I've done it. And I have to thank the media. The media were really great, and they gave me all the publicity a regular author would get. And so I've been on the bestseller list, which is unbelievable for a self-published book.
Now, I have one last question for you. given everything that you've been through, and you've had quite an extraordinary life, is there anything you would change?
No, I don't regret anything. And I would not I loved working at the Globe and Mail. It's a wonderful newspaper. I love that kind of journalism. But I would never compromise anything just to work there. I have to stick true to my principles and my belief. And in this case, it was, if I'm sick, I'm sick. And I have a right to be sick. And you are supposed to believe me because you believed me for 20 years. Everything I wrote. If you don't believe me now, then let's go down that road and I'll see you at the end. So I have no regrets.
Well, Jan Wong, I have really enjoyed this time with you, finding out more about your life, your extraordinary life and your book. And I wish you all the best with your book. And would love to catch up with you at some point in the future and see, how the sales went and whatnot.
Yeah.
So maybe we can do a catch up some point.
Okay, it's great being here.
Well, thanks again. Well, for more information about Jan Wong, you can find out more about her on her episode page at my website, extraordinarywomentv.com. You'll see this interview, her bio, and there'll be more information there for you. Well, coming up in the second half of the show, we'll be talking about a dinner travel club. So stay with us.